Okay, so hi, today is June 4th. This is the 7th in a series of classes on Mr. LaRouche's textbook called So, You Wish to Learn All About Economics. The discussion today is going to be on chapters 9 and 10, which are on basic economic infrastructure and on inflation. So to start with, though, we're going to go over what some of the responses were from the homework from the last class. Now, the last class was on wages and population, chapter 8, and the questions were about education, both people's experiences with education and what it ought to be, with jobs, people's past jobs, and whether they were satisfying or not, and what somebody should get out of their work, and then some ideas about what the last class and homework ought to be. So I'm going to read a few excerpts from some of the answers to those homeworks before we get into what we're going to be talking about today. So on the first question, which was about different people's experience with education, somebody had written in about an early teacher who had them do a lot of painting after their field trips and things like that, which she credits with making her very playful. And then this is interesting. Apparently, a English teacher who, here, I'll just read this quote. It says, "The best example I can think of is that this teacher held up two books. One was a Leo Tolstoy book, not the greatest guy or anything, and the other book was pornography." And I guess, I don't know what he was doing with a book of pornography in school, but anyway, then the teacher asked, "Which one of these has a greater aesthetical value for your mind?" The homework says, "I remember it being the first time I ever thought that not all books or ideas are equal, and some can have a negative effect on your mind, and others can have a positive one. Not the kind of liberal crap you get used to in Berkeley, California." That is true. Some other answers were sort of, here's one. "Thinking back on it, I don't remember having an inspiring moment in class at all." Compare that with what our association does in terms of education, in terms of its curriculum and training people how to think. It's a world's difference, because I get inspired when I make a breakthrough, as any human would, and know that I am developing. That is more important for young people than merely acquiring knowledge. Then some of the discussion about how education ought to play a role in our movement. I'll read a couple excerpts again. About recruitment. Here's one. "If someone has a spark, they can't be let go. And you can see that spark from the moment you meet them, if you are paying attention and can see into their soul. Because even if they're covered in slime from the culture, their soul shines through, and you have to want to allow that person to thrive instead of just survive. And that means fighting with their axioms, because you're not fighting only with theirs, but also with your own axioms. The best teacher is a student, and the best student is a teacher, because learning is a social process." Absolutely true. Here's another one. "While participating in this class, I've been holding on to a question that came since the first session. How do we measure culture? That's been very provocative to me. And I've really been challenging myself to discover what Lynn did in economics, which has been extremely fun. I don't think I can say I'm a master yet, but damn it, I know that I figured something out, which is the point, I think." And then on an idea for what we ought to do in the future, "I propose that we emphasize the importance of classical artistic composition and somehow use this in a class series. Something like a series on Shakespeare, Schiller, or Bach. Something like that would be essential and fun. Another fun idea would be a series on Bernardsky. I don't know that much about him other than excerpts I've read here and there. I think he'd be important to work through." So that was some of the things that came in on education. On jobs, there were very different answers on this one, too. One answer, "In my early days, I was a waitress, and there was nothing satisfactory about having that job." That's pretty straightforward. Somebody had talked about jobs in service sector, which was never very rewarding. Even if you feel proud about, you're managing the store right and everything, you still feel sort of used, and what are you really accomplishing? And comparing that to working in doing farming type work, gardening and wood cutting. And then another answer was about a job doing science research, which is fun. And then working with young people, and an example of helping a 7th grader who didn't know how to write a sentence giving this person a journal and helping her learn how to write. And then listen to this. On the question of using the example Lynn gave of transforming a machine tool by taking out one part of it and replacing it with a laser, where the rest of the machine tool operates the same way, but because it's using a laser instead of a cutting head or something, every part of that machine is more productive because it's part of a more productive process. So same thing with people in an economy. If you change what the whole society is doing, even if the person's still doing the same thing, they're more productive. Their work changes. So here's one of the homework answers someone wrote in. I think people would generally feel like their life and actions have more meaning if society was in a direction of progress. You would know that your efforts weren't just you acting in an empty box, but in coordination with society to grow. This is a big reason why I joined the LaRouche movement, is I knew that even though I may have felt good doing good things or helping people, I knew that society, as it is now, wouldn't allow those things to really have meaning unless it were changed. That's why we need a science driver. That's why we need people to take part in a national mission, like what people knew was in the space mission. People deserve to know that their actions are immortal, even if they don't see the effects right now. Exactly, and that's exactly the point Lynn was making in the second half of Chapter 8, so very good. So, all right, so let's move ahead now to, and if you haven't sent yours in yet, feel free. Better late than never. So on the two chapters we're going to be talking about today, basic economic infrastructure and inflation, I'm going to start by showing a graph. Lynn opens up Chapter 9 on infrastructure, saying that in doing some economic studies some decades ago, the research team he was heading up found that the biggest correlation between economic growth and any other factor was investment in infrastructure. That had the biggest correlation with growth in the productive powers of labor. So I want to show you a chart, and this is going to be, you're going to make your own version of this chart in the homework here. So hopefully you can see that. The chart says electricity consumption versus GDP per capita. And yes, I am embarrassed about using GDP, but it seemed to be the easiest to use among a bunch of other. I made some other charts too, like life expectancy and some other things. So what you're seeing on this chart is along the x-axis is the watts per capita, and then going up in the y direction, you see the GDP per capita. So if you you can see there's an obviously huge trend there, where there's just no doubt that the biggest, if you wanted to say what's the best, one of the best predictors of how well people are going to live, it's what's their energy use. I mean, just leaving the lights on all night, or not unplugging something when you're done using it, that doesn't make you richer or make the economy better. But people who would like to say that due to global warming, these developing countries, they're just not going to live like we did. Like when Obama in Africa said, I'm sorry, if everybody here had a car and air conditioning, the world would melt. You guys are just going to have to be poor. That's exactly what it means. If you're going to deny countries access to electricity and to using high levels of energy flux density and just energy, you're saying you're going to be poor and you're going to die early. Another chart I made was life expectancy compared to electricity consumption. And if you've got low electricity in your country, you're going to die young. That's just how it is. It's part of the society that helps people live longer. So, that's the basis for looking at what Lynn's going to say about infrastructure here. And, he talks about, you guys can read the chapter, a lot of the stuff's pretty straightforward. Talks about how infrastructure is naturally a basic government function, traditionally, and it just makes sense. Primarily by direct spending. That's the biggest way that government is involved with infrastructure. And then also he gives a few other examples. Government corporations, like the Tennessee Valley Authority is it's a government corporation. Port authorities around the country are government corporations. And then he also talks about private things that are still operated as, by regulation under the government. For example, in many states, the power companies they're private companies, but the way they work is very regulated, or at least it was, a decade ago, or 2 decades ago now. So, the rates are set and everything. So it's a private thing, private company, but it's regulated. It's an inherently public function. Same thing with, with Amtrak, which is, it's not really a government program, or Greyhound, which is regulated. Greyhound's not a government bus service, though. Now, then he brings something up, which is that if you don't invest in infrastructure, like right now we're not maintaining our infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers gave us a D+ or D-, I forget, D something, for the state of the nation's infrastructure. And he says, look, if you're not investing in maintaining your infrastructure, where does that cost show up? In other words, letting things decay, letting things deteriorate and not doing the maintenance to bring them back up to standards, that's a cost in your economy. You had something valuable, infrastructure, and now it's worse. It's very tempting for people to say, we had a bigger profit. We cut spending. We have more money. You didn't. You actually have less because you have thrown away and not maintained the infrastructural wealth. So, he talks about how if you look at whatever the, like today, for example, the American Society of Civil Engineers says we need over $3.5 trillion to get our infrastructure back up to snuff over a decade. That means that however much money the U.S. has supposedly created over the past several decades, you have to subtract $3.6 trillion from it, because that supposed profit came from not investing in infrastructure. I mean, if you stopped eating for a day, you'd say you made more money that week, but I mean, if you do that for a while, you're obviously going to have to make up for that, or you're going to die. So now, why is the infrastructure not maintained? Is it that people just are being short-sighted? No. Then he goes through, he's got a whole section. This is really great. He's got a chapter on basic economic infrastructure, and half of it is on the oligarchy and how lackeys operate and what a conspiracy is, and the whole treason. And it gives a 3-page summary of Tony Chaikin's Treason in America book. So it's really great. But he says, look, let's give examples. He gives an example of the New Haven Railroad, which was bought up. Control of that railroad was taken over. And then the new owners didn't invest in it, sucked money out of it, and then left it as an empty hulk. That example's decades old, so one of your homework questions is to think of a more recent example of this primitive accumulation, of basically sucking out what's been accumulated to make a short-term gain. And he said this is done as a deliberate policy of destroying the U.S. It goes back to Adam Smith taking a carriage ride where he was getting his instructions on what his job was to destroy the U.S., in part by writing The Wealth of Nations, which some very silly people think is a guide to how the United States developed. It isn't. Adam Smith was British, not an American. We had a war. So on the oligarchs, I'll just read a couple quotes on this. The section is very thorough, and you can read it yourself, but to point out a couple things that are particularly relevant. On page 175, he says the Neo-Malthusians, they're a force, they're trying to destroy humanity. And he says, therefore, we must not delude ourselves that by rushing to these circles with proof that the destruction of the U.S. infrastructure has been a disaster, that we would persuade them to discover the error of their ways. That is straightforwardly making the case, gee, it makes sense to invest in these things. You're not going to get anywhere with that, because the reason it's not being invested in isn't that people didn't know it was a good idea. It's that there's a policy of destruction. Like fusion. If you take a look at Megan Beats's article on the suppression of fusion, some fusion scientists think, well, we just need to make the case clearer, or there's just not quite enough money, or Congress just doesn't really get it. They're not scientists. That's not why we don't have fusion. It's because a Zeusian faction has decided we are not going to have fusion. And then the budgets are set starting from that intention not to get fusion. Not that the case hasn't been made. It's been made. So sometimes this looks like a conspiracy. There is a conspiracy going on. It's right to see a conspiracy in the way these things are being done. But he says most people who look for conspiracies, they just don't get it. They usually look one level below the level of what's really directing things. So rather than looking at the level of the British Empire, rather than looking at the level of these oligarchical economic royalists, people see their lackeys. And then they look at how these lackeys operate, like, Henry Kissinger or David Alamiel, or somebody who, they owe their existence to somebody above them, and they operate on their behalf. It might look like a conspiracy, but the other point LaRouche makes is that people often very wrongly believe that these conspiracies are based on greed. I'm sure we've all met people in the field who think, all the time, people say, well, these guys, they're greedy. That's why these bad things are happening, because there's these greedy people in power, and, power corrupts, and they're really greedy, and they want to, make more money or something. That's not it. Zeus wasn't greedy. He had an outlook for the human race that he wanted to implement. The British Empire isn't greedy. The queen doesn't want to, have 100 more horses to, run around or something. She doesn't want to have one more castle to decorate. The goal is a control of the human race. That's what the goal is. It's not about making more money. So, and this is the block people have in understanding an oligarchy. People don't want to go all the way there and recognize what it means that there's a fight between Zeus and Prometheus. And it's much easier to think of corrupt people up top who express in a more exaggerated form, the greed that we might all feel a little bit on occasion. Just take your own feelings of selfishness, multiply them by 1,000,000, and then say that's, Dick Cheney. That's not how it works. So, so then he moves on. So, he makes this point here that the value of infrastructure is undeniable. The reason it's being undermaintained is a deliberate attempt to destroy the country. And then he gets back into talking about where we need to go in the future, and he goes in a surprising direction with it. He points out that that infrastructure is like a capital investment. That if you look at the whole nation's economy as if it was one firm, just as one factory will have capital investments to have their machinery and things like that, the nation as a whole has a capital investment in infrastructure, which, it's not localized to a particular productive function, but it's like a rising tide. It provides a platform on which everything else operates. So then LaRouche goes to the moon, and he brings it back. He says, we got to talk about how we design our cities. Our cities are terrible. Urban infrastructure has got the most potential for investment, for having a huge return on spending and investment in urban infrastructure. It's phenomenal. So we need to do that, he says, by looking at planning our cities from the standpoint of how we plan to make cities on the moon eventually. So he says, don't start from what we already do. Start from what we really should be doing. Think 30 to 50 years ahead. And some aspects of future life aren't going to change that much. He says the size of the house, you're not going to need to have, an 80-story house or something. I mean, some of these things we can predict a couple hundred years into the future to some degree what people are going to need. He says build your cities starting with the infrastructure. There's multiple layers of infrastructure, like the like the cargo cap idea in Germany about having a transportation network underground, connecting your factories. You got your energy, you got your transportation underground, multiple levels. You make that very durable. It's there to last for a couple of centuries. This will be expensive, but it's worth it. It'll last. People like living in cities for a reason. Then in terms of how those cities would be built, it says it'll be centered around, I don't need to read, it's in the book. I mean, you can read the book, so I feel silly over summarizing. But there's the details there, but then one thing I wanted to bring up was that he says cities need to be of finite sizes. Like right now, we're not really making new cities in the U.S., like fundamentally new cities. Like, all right, here there's nothing, and we're going to make a whole city. We're going to plan out streets, we're going to put in the infrastructure, etc. You might get like one of these, fake urban things where they take a suburban area and they put in some parallel, and they put in like a grid of streets and a parking garage to give you like an urban feel. That's not what we need. He's saying limit your city sizes. Elsewhere, he said 500,000 or a million really should be the biggest size of a city. And then if you have more people who need somewhere to live, make another city. Don't just have the suburban disgustingness spreading out, indefinitely. We actually need to go back because, if you look at the original construction of the older cities in the U.S., a lot of the stuff predated cars. And so that's one of the reasons for that, the compactness and the way things were organized. One of the major downsides of the interstate freeway system and, just letting zoning totally go in a devil-may-care way is that you've got this suburban mess. So instead of that, we got to actually plan out cities, like China's doing, like India's doing, planning or along the World Land Bridge, like pearls on a necklace. New cities, and it'll be a city, and then beyond it, it won't be the city anymore. There'll be some farms, and then there'll be another city. It'll be great. More people will live in a real city. It'll be wonderful, and we'll be able to go between them, and it'll just culturally, this will be fantastic. So he says, look, what's it going to be like? Will this be expensive? Yeah, hugely expensive. But imagine what would we be capable of doing if we had 50% operatives? How productive could we be if we had 50% operatives? And he's writing this at a time when the number was much higher than it is today. It was in around 20% when he was writing the book. Today it's below that, for sure. So much of it's imports. But if you had that kind of amount of productivity, physically, people would be quite well off. We'd be able to have cities. We'd be able to have a house. You'd be able to have decent things. It's going to be very difficult to get there at first, but with 50% operatives with a science driver, these things are possible. High-paying jobs, and deservedly so, because they produce something. And then at the end, talk about getting ahead of himself here. That's the wrong phrase. He says, not only must we distribute water supplies, he talks about moving water around. He says, we must also manufacture water supplies. Controlled thermonuclear fusion will render this production of fresh water supplies economical. Which, this report that we've been floating around about making all of the water needed for a world population twice today would be a world power need of right about midway in that chart that you saw, per capita power use. So today it would be very significant for most countries at the current level to try to have about 1,000, 1,500 watts per person to produce the needed water. But if we've got a fusion economy, if we've got 40,000 watts per capita, it's really not a big deal to just produce the water that you need from fusion. Among other things, for causing the rain to rain where you want it to. That's even easier. We should do all of these things. So then I'll just read his last couple sentences here. He says, thus improvement and maintenance of infrastructure makes possible the increase of the potential relative population density. Because it's the basis of all of these other things. That is the general functional significance of that capital goods subcategory called basic economic infrastructure. Hence, the close correlation between rates of improvement of infrastructure and rises in productivity. So he's come back full circle the way he composed this chapter and explained why you see the thing that he described in the beginning of the incredible correlation between infrastructure investment and increases in the productive powers of labor. So those are the main things, just to give an overview on Chapter 9. On Chapter 10 on inflation, it's very briefly. He says briefly on inflation. It's 3 pages long. Maybe more like 2.5, because he's got the title as in large font. Basically saying it's really not a big deal. But he says if you want to worry about inflation, you know, the biggest cause for inflation is not the government producing way too much credit and, you know, spending so much of it on roadways and high-speed rail that all this extra money flowing out to rail workers is just, you know, there's a huge flow of cash and that's causing inflation. That's not where the inflation is occurring. It says what happens whenever you put money or a money equivalent into circulation, however you make that money. On Wall Street, they make money. You know, they just make it on a computer. Whenever you do that, you know, it's quantitative easing, leveraging, that supposed money, whether it really exists or what that even means, it definitely can be used as a claim against some real production or a real service. So, like the image of the, you know, the 80-pound or 200-pound or 300-pound or 2-ton tick sucking all of the blood out of this poor dog, that's what you have today. He says that's what Wall Street is doing. That, listen to this. He says, this is from page 187 to 188. He says, money put into circulation, or money substitutes, such as paper negotiable for money, credit taken as payment, and as a claim against money, that money, it goes somewhere, and is ultimately presented as a claim for tangible wealth or labor. For example, payment of money taken on account of financial usury or ground rent is part of the waste component of overhead expense. It goes into the hands of the recipient in return for nothing. There is no exchange, there is merely a taking. The obligation to pay such claims by production and distribution of physical goods, by paid labor, and so forth, is a tax added implicitly to the price of everything. Costs rise accordingly. Cost pressures push up prices. The economy is paying more for its total output and receiving nothing in return. Inflation. Yet someone receives this money and presents it as a claim for payment in tangible wealth or labor somewhere. So he says, unless you clean out, if you've got this parasitical explosive bubble of Wall Street and financial speculation, he says, unless you clean that up, even doing good things with credit can cause inflation. Because if the credit that's being created is being siphoned through Wall Street and being leveraged and being used for fictitious monetary gains there, then that is increasing this inflation tax on everything. I think that makes reasonably clear sense. If money's being created, then everything costs more because now people with this made-up money can use it to buy things. And so they're just like sucking out production from the economy and giving nothing in return. So that makes everything cost more. There's less of what's produced to go around for the people actually involved in producing any of it. So it's a stealing. So one of the homework questions is on this, to quantify this, to get the, but maybe someone can just do it on their, you know, do it right now. We can have the answer together. One of the earlier homework questions about estimating C and V and D and S prime, people came up with about 22% of the, 78% of GDP comes from services. So the question on this homework for chapters 9 and 10 is, what percent of GDP comes from financial services? And the second question is, what percent of people work in financial services? To give you a sense of the size of the tick that's sitting on the dog, because it's not that many people. If anyone wants to look that up right now, that'd be great. And then this creating this huge amount of supposed GDP, which is claims for payment of real production. So what I'm do now is just give an overview of what the homework questions are going to be, and then we can talk about the chapters. I hope people have read them already, or we can read some sections of them together. Let's see where it goes. But the homework on this, and Scott in California has already done question 1. Although everyone needs to do it, it's going to be good. So question one is about this correlation between investment in infrastructure and economic productivity. And then I included a quote from a much later paper by LaRouche from 2005 called Science, the Power to Prosper, where Lynn talks about when you transfer production from an area of high infrastructure density and you put that same production somewhere with less infrastructure density, say a third world nation, to take advantage of cheaper labor or no environmental regulation, that there's a monetary profit in doing that, but it's not just that there's no physical profit. It's not just that there's no physical profit. It's that there's a physical decline in the value of that labor and the value of that factory, because less efficient infrastructure, et cetera, means that there's more effort that's involved in moving those goods from that factory and providing the electricity to that factory and getting the water to that factory and moving the people to that factory. So the homework is there's a Google spreadsheet, which if you've never used a spreadsheet before, here's your introduction. This one's very easy to use. You're just going to go to the CIA World Factbook website and find for a few countries of your choosing the population of those countries, the GDP, I know it's embarrassing, but we're going to use it, and the amount of rail in the country, and the amount of electricity consumed in the country. When you put those things in the spreadsheet, it'll go ahead and put the rail and the electricity into per capita units, and then it'll make a chart for you that compares electricity consumption with GDP, and then also compares the amount of rail per capita, how many feet of railroad exists per person, and compares that with the economy. So that sort of recreates the, it's not the same as what Lynn described in the opening of the chapter, because he looked at over time. You invest in infrastructure and then the economy increases. So we're not looking over time, we're just looking at 4 countries as they exist now. It's making the point that's in LaRouche's 2005 paper. So that's the first one. That one's straightforward and it's very fun. And if you need help, ask anybody, ask me. And then when you're done, you'll have your very own unique personal chart that you can print out and use in the field and show people to make your point. The second question is about finding a more recent example of what LaRouche described about the New Haven Railroad, where he talked about how it was looted by people who bought it up, didn't invest in it, and pulled the money out. There's a quote from a 2001 paper by Lynn on primitive accumulation, and the question is to think of a more modern example. As a hint, there's from Bill Clinton's recent speech. Bill Clinton talked about somebody, an activist investor at Dow Chemical, who wanted a really quick return on his investment. And Dow said, well, we're going to build this new chemical plant. It's going to cost some money. It'll take us 5 years to build it, and then it's going to be really efficient. We'll make a lot of money selling chemicals. It'll be great. And the activist investor said, 5 years? I'm not going to wait that long. I want my money right now. So that would be an example of, obviously, a chemical company. It takes time to build up all the equipment for the, the sometimes very complex processes they're involved in to produce the chemicals that then go into all sorts of things around us, everything from paint to fertilizer to batteries. So there's that one. The third question is to write a short story about life in the year 2050 in one of these new cities with the honeycomb of infrastructure and no suburban sprawl. It would be so nice. Maybe you could describe your fictional family going to the edge of the city and it actually ends. Astonishing. And then the easy, and then this last one, question 4, which people might have already answered here in the audience, is to take a look at the percent of GDP from financial services and the percent of people involved in financial services to get a sense of how it's a big bloated Wall Street tax.
It looks like 2013 is 4% of people employed are employed in finance.
Wow, 4% of people are involved in financial services, and then we find out what percent of the GDP that is.
Yeah, 9%.
9%? I was hoping it'd be bigger. It doesn't sound like a very big tick.
Well, I thought it was 30%.
80% of businesses are owned in
30%.
one way or another by hedge funds.
80% of businesses are owned by hedge funds. Here. You said you got 30%, Johnny?
Yeah. I went to this World Bank the World Bank website.
Uh-huh.
They said it's 30% of the of the GDP.
30% of it is financial services or.
Um,
You want to share your screen so we can see?
how do I do that?
Uh-oh. Well, it's the in the left side of the Hangout. There's a little green screen with an arrow going like this. It says screen share. If you click that, then you click your web browser window, and we should all be able to see it.
Oh, screen share. Okay. Do you want to start?
What I found was 9% is just compensation of financial intermediaries.
Oh, wow. The 9% found here, 9% of the GDP is financial services people being paid. Just their paychecks. Wow.
Express everyone else.
Huh?
Does that make sense? Sorry.
I'm sorry, actually, I
Get
looked
that?
away.
What,
The
the screen?
Could you put it back? Well, now it's not. Could you put it back up?
Oh. Yeah, hold on. It's wait.
Okay. Oh.
Is this the right thing that I'm looking at?
Like the 30% I see looks like it's household debt. No. Wait, where?
Oh, okay, okay. I must have looked at the wrong thing.
Okay.
Whatever. I'll keep looking at it.
Okay. Because people, so these lobbyists would say, financial services creates a huge percentage of America's GDP. We're so important. We're a major industry. The financial services industry. I mean,
They told us in the New York State Legislature that 20% of the New York State budget comes from private investment firms, taxes on them.
wow. Did you guys hear that? 20% of New York State budget comes from taxes on private investment firms. Like, that was a big thing that that used to be able to keep California's state budget somewhat working. Was the it was a little bit different, but it's just capital gains, state capital gains taxes on the people making money off the stock market. Okay.
I found 6 million people employed in financial services.
Yeah, it's about
That's less than 4%.
of people employed. There's
Yeah.
about 144 million people employed. 6 million. So.
60% of those people who are.
Oh.
All right. Well, looks like we don't have the exact answer yet. Well, good. Well, that'll be for homework then. Plus, it's a research skill to how to, just figure how to Google that. Google those things. So, that's about it. Let me just return to showing that chart one more time that I showed at the beginning. Give you a sense of what what the chart will likely look like when you do question 1. So you can see the chart again here of electricity consumption versus GDP. So again, look at all those countries that are clustered down with little electricity. I mean, there's no country that's using a small amount of electricity that has a prosperous economy. Doesn't happen. So when you plug in your numbers for question 1, you'll get 2 charts. The first one will look something like that, and the second one on rail will look like, well, it'll be a surprise. You get to see what it looks like yourself. So, any thoughts, questions, discussion about the chapters, or thoughts from the homeworks from last week or this week? Last week?
I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
On the inflation stuff,
Yeah.
is it that Wall Street determines the inflation, or is it the government, or who determines the price of things?
Right. Well, it ends up indirectly changing the prices. So Lynn's point is, if there's more money that's out there that could be used to buy things, then that can make the prices go up because there's all this just money that could now be purchasing things. So in other words, if banks and Wall Street are just being given money by the government, basically money is free right now. If a bank wants a loan from the government, it's free. It's 0%. It's just free money. They have to say they'll give it back eventually. But, or they just get a new loan to do that. And then you use that to speculate, you make a lot of money. So when that's allowed, when you've got it so that banks are able to borrow money from the government and then use it to speculate, because they're both normal banks and investment banks, then there's just this creation of money without actually doing anything. The more that happens, the more Wall Street is able to get in terms of profits. That causes inflation. When looked at in terms of people who actually do work, because if you look at the productive part of it's tough to think about this because so much of what we consume is imports now. But imagine that we actually produce things in the U.S. We produce most of what we actually needed. The productive part of the workforce, producing all these things, etc., now has got Wall Street coming in and saying, well, we're going to buy up some of that stuff that you produced with the money that we made. When they buy it up, there's less to go around. So it's like stealing the goods, or it's like meaning you're gonna have to pay more to get it now. So it's like an indirect tax on everybody. It causes inflation. So like the inflation rate right now, this is one of these things where there's so many lies in the statistics coming out of the government. Like unemployment is just they don't include people who have expired from their unemployment benefits. Another big one is inflation. I don't know what does anyone have seen any recent supposed inflation rates? It's like they do so much cheating when they report what the inflation rate is. Like for one thing, they'll say products are better than they used to be. So even if they cost more, it doesn't really count. Like paper towels cost more, but they're a smaller size sheet. So you can use a sheet that's half as big as before, and that's so much of a benefit in the kitchen that it's fine if they cost 20% more because they're 20% better. So there's no inflation in paper towels. Or they say, cars cost much more now than they did 30 years ago.
Current U.S. inflation rate for the past 10 years is 2%.
Supposedly our inflation rate is 2%.
From 2004.
But they also don't include certain things like food in that figure.
Well, they don't include food in the inflation rate naturally. Yeah. No, they say that there's some things that are volatile, that they change and they move around. So they're not going to count those when they measure inflation. And those things include gas. Has anyone noticed that gas has inflated a little bit more than 2% a year over the past couple decades? I mean, can't fill up your tank for $20 anymore, and that's well more than 2%, to get up to 60 or 70. Gas, food. I forget all the things they don't include. They basically don't include like everything, and then everything that's left is like is like I don't know, a DVD player or clothes or something like that, or things that are imported and that let them make a bigger fake with the what do they call it? QAF, quality adjustment factor, where they say that the paper towels are so much better because they have like a picture of a pie on them or something. So
Actually, what I read about that is the way that inflation hasn't gone up. If you take an Apple computer or an Apple iPad, the price isn't going up, but the technology is getting better.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, this is an example of how inflation is not that high.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
They're already ridiculously expensive.
Well, and it's plus like if you pick some things like computers or something like that. Sure, are they getting cheaper to do what they did a few years ago? Absolutely. What's the inflation on the price of those things? Could you say it's negative? Yeah, I mean it's getting cheaper to do the same thing, but people also, in addition to having computers, need food, Healthcare. Is healthcare inflated only 2% over the past decade? Healthcare costs? Absolutely not. So it's there. That's one of the most scandalously falsified statistics that exists. The inflation rate.
Oh, we should have a homework question to try to figure out what the real inflation has been over the last 10 years.
Good question. I don't know if you guys heard that. Alexander said another homework idea would be, what is the real inflation rate over the past 10 years? How much have prices actually gone up? I know one way EIR would report that was the average number of weekly paychecks to purchase certain things. So they'd say for the average family's insurance premiums, how many of that family's paychecks every year, how many of those go to paying for their insurance? How many of their paychecks go to paying for their mortgage or their rent? How many of those paychecks go to paying for their transportation needs? So that's one way that also sort of, obviously things are in terms of money, but it takes it outside of just looking at money and comparing money to money in the past. You're looking at what are you able to actually get with your money. Although, yeah, for plenty of them, just the money. I mean, like healthcare and gasoline are, pretty obviously more than 2%.
Yeah, there was always supposed to be a proportion of your annual income that you spent on housing, food, so forth. And when you look at that, how that's changed, I mean, people spend like 80, 90, or 300% of their annual income on housing.
Yeah.
Have a mortgage.
Yeah, mortgages and rents. I mean, they're completely insane. I don't, I'm sure in the 60s and 70s there was some tried and true percentage of, don't get a mortgage that's more than 20%. I made that number up of your annual income. Now it's like, how many people are paying like, is half of their income going to their rent and utilities? That's the thing. You just ask old people. I'm sure you've never run case. That sounded funny. I'm sure people, not everybody watching this is. Anyway, if you compare the experience of previous generations and how much you talk to them, like, wow, you mean you could pay the rent on your apartment with a part-time job?
This is like Lynn going to get his haircut.
Lynn going to get his haircut?
He made a whole webcast speech about inflation.
Oh, yeah.
And you didn't even have that much hair.
Inflation in hair? Yeah, right. The per hair inflation rate is probably 1,000% for Lynn, right?
Or when he was talking about the shirt, $100 for a shirt?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, clothes.
Supposed if you're not at Marshall's or something, it's it's insane.
Actually, I have a question going back to Chapter 8.
Sure.
He actually brought it up before, but he has the chart going through, working backwards from, the production of goods back to where they started.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to think of different examples in my head of how that process happened, of how production happens, and I couldn't quite figure out. I couldn't think of what an intermediate market basket would be. That might be kind of a technical question.
That's a good question. Yeah, if I remember that, that chart he had at the lowest level, he had the raw materials market baskets from agriculture and from resource extraction. And then at the top level, he had the final market baskets. And in the middle, he had some things that would go in the intermediate ones would be, for example, steel. It's funny because, every factory that produces something that you would call an intermediate good, they consider it to be their final good, and they also have their own intermediate goods, obviously. But take a steel plant as something that would fit nicely in the middle. Most people don't, most projects don't call for just producing steel. We've got a national goal of having a lot of steel sitting around or something like that. You use it to build things with. So steel's not a raw material. It's not the iron ore and all of that. It's not, nothing a steel mill produces is going to be a final good that can be used for anything. It could be used for construction, but again, construction is part of, well, if it's a house, fine, it would be, be part of making a house. But the house would be a final good. The steel that produces the house would be an intermediate one, for example. You might see like treated lumber you might put in there, machine tools. I think those are the kinds of things that would fit in that category.
Wouldn't you call some of those things capital goods, though?
Yeah, they are. Let me look at that chart. What page is it on?
It's on page 148.
Okay, so let's chart again here. So we got on the bottom natural resources, agricultural goods, industrial goods, raw materials market basket, intermediate market basket. And then we produce both consumer goods and capital goods. Yes, good point. Yeah, the machine tools would be in the capital goods market basket. And then, steel would be, I don't know, it's the only example that's really coming to mind right now. That would be an intermediate market basket. The steel itself isn't a capital good in that sense, and it's not a consumer good either. And he returns to it later on when he talks about looking at that first figure a little later on in the chapter. Anyway, referring to figure 1. It says on page 157 when he's talking about the goals of a growing economy. He says on that page, referring to figure 1, the one you had referred to, he says this requires an associated reduction in the percentile of the operatives component of the labor force employed in raw materials production, and shifting all of this relative decrease to employment in either capital goods output or intermediate goods production. We must do this while collapsing the waste sector, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway. Yeah, I think intermediate goods are inputs to higher level processes that aren't part of. You know what? Why don't I try and figure out it? Why don't we try to get a real good? I was just going to make up something. Well, I've got a hypothesis that it would be something that's consumed as part of the productive process higher up, without being a durable part of it. So a machine tool is a capital good. Steel, which is then being used in an auto factory, it's an input to the auto factory, but it's not a durable good of the auto factory. They're using it as part of the production cycle, as opposed to having it be there to help produce things like their forges and mills and things are.
I got another question.
Sure.
I know when this topic of what would be production tied to that, or service, or other categories. What about like wine or like cigars or something? Like, because people like to drink wine or even beer, and it's not too productive, but they still do it. I'm having trouble figuring out where you would categorize that.
Well, in terms of the production of those things, so they would fit in. It actually depends on who's eating it. That's one of the tough things about food, is that in terms of, to the extent the food is being eaten by, for example, Lynn gives the example of, even though the farmer isn't making milk with a new high-tech technology, like the cow isn't like a mechanized, it's not a cyborg cow or something like that. It's just milk. And the guy's, he's the researcher, she's having it for breakfast, and then she's figuring something out. Okay, the milk is part of her life. It's not made maybe with a new technology, but it's part of then what that person does. Do they work in, are they making water pumps? If that's what they do, then the milk would be V. It would be, when Lynn breaks down production into the C, V, D, and S prime back in chapter 4, right? That milk would be V if it's for that household. That milk would be part of D when it's drunk by a Wall Street banker who, washes his dog in milk or whatever. I don't know. something some luxurious use of milk. So yeah, same thing with wine or beer. Or, donuts. You might say donuts have negative, health value. Maybe we should outlaw them. I keep me from eating them. But yeah. So if the wine's going to a productive household, it's part of V. If it's going to a different kind of household, like if a teacher's having some, it's in D, education. So you have to look to where it goes. And if you're just getting totally drunk, that's D, waste. That's where that gets. But it's not the wine's fault. Wine isn't inherently, yeah. And it was actually a necessary invention in the path of history because it was something that would actually not go bad. Fermented beverages kept. So you could take them on a long trip and they wouldn't get gross and moldy like water would because they're already moldy in a specific way. So cigars, I don't know. I think that cigars are a waste, but I don't know. More generally, if you think about this this thing that this homework response had about the teacher who held up the two books, the Tolstoy and then the pornographic book, and said, which of these books has a greater aesthetical value for your mind? It's like, it's not just like, well, a book's a book, whatever. What's the value of culture? So maybe that's a broader thing. To say, what's the value of like some music or something like that? What's the economic value of shitty pop music? What's the economic value of Brahms? And it depends on what you do with it. Like Brahms' economic value is up to us at this point. But the potential that music has on somebody's mind, the ability that it has for culture, that has economic value. Yeah. Like if you're addicted, if you've got some sort of addiction to whatever it might be, you think that you don't want to let it go. That whatever that might be actually has negative economic value for you. Okay. Anything else from 8, 9, or 10? Questions about the homework? When you do the spreadsheet, I don't know, I'm not sure if everybody's used Google Docs that much before, but when you do the spreadsheet, when you click on the link, you'll get the spreadsheet and you can't edit it because it's the homework version of the spreadsheet. So you just have to make sure you save a copy of it, and then you can put in your own numbers into the cells in the spreadsheet. And then when you're done, you can export it and send it, or you can click share in the upper right and share it.
I was wrong. Since 2004, it's ostensibly 25%.
Oh, total.
Cumulative.
Oh, okay. Since 2004, official inflation is a cumulative 25%. Well, yeah, that's not that different, but okay. Anything else? Okay. Well, I look forward to seeing everybody's. The other thing is once these spreadsheets, when these spreadsheets get turned in, I'll make a new one that puts together everybody's answers from that. So then we'll have a chart that we all worked on. It'll show electricity and GDP, and then especially it'll have the rail one, which isn't made yet. So putting that together, that'll be something that we're all going to do together. Then we'll have an awesome chart showing rail and economy. We can make some more in the future. So, all right. Look forward to hearing everybody's responses, and then so next week will be the last class in the series. So we'll talk about the general theme for it is, you know, the next 30 years, because this book is 30 years old, and LaRouche has written a lot of papers and had a lot of thoughts and made more discoveries since then. So that's what we're going to be talking about, as well as having a final sort of project, which will be through the form of. Here's one thing I was thinking about: is that in doing these things, is that basically all of these homework questions all along the whole way in this class, if you do them, you're going to be a better teacher. I mean, if you've done them, you're going to have something then that you figured out, right? You're going to learn something on your own. You've gotten something, you put it together, and then that'll be something that you can use when you're teaching economics classes yourself. So that's something to think about it everywhere, is that, you know, let's get a process where we're getting contacts around, and, you know, economic series and in the different offices, that's something we've done in the past frequently. So are you going to be the one, are you going to be teaching that next? What are you going to do when you're the one running it? So keep that in mind when you're answering these things, and keep it in mind when you decide to answer them. So I'll see you guys next week for our last discussion. Right. Okay, today is June 11th, 2014, and this is the 8th in a series of classes on Lyndon LaRouche's economics textbook titled, So, You Wish to Learn All About Economics? The class is available, the book's available in the video description for the video, and if you go to the playlists that you'll find this video in, you can find the rest of the whole series of classes. Talking to YouTube here. So this is the last class. What we're going to do is start by going over the homework responses from the last homework. We're going to review the whole book, which is, I was astonished going through it at how much is in this book. It really is a masterpiece. And then talk about what's next, both for economics in particular, and then with this educational series that we've been doing at this typical time on Wednesdays. So to start things off, the first of the homework questions from this last session was to create, we did this collaboratively, we created together, I'm pulling the picture up here. Let me switch over to the picture view for you guys. There we go. So what you're seeing here is the chart that I showed at the last class comparing electricity consumption and GDP per capita. And that was for all the countries in the world. What we did for the homework was people chose some of their own countries of interest, and then we put together what people had chosen, and this is the chart that came up. So as you can see, it shows the same trend, that if you compare electricity consumption measured as watts of electricity per capita, and you compare that with GDP, and yes, most of the book's about why GDP is a bad measure, but there's some other ones. We can make some more charts. That might be a project for you to take up after this class. But using this basic comparison, you see really clearly that if you don't have electricity, you're going to be poor, which shouldn't be a stunning conclusion, but here you've got it. The other part of the homework was to do the same thing with rail. Here's a chart showing rail per capita, because, well, anyway, same thing. On the x-axis is the number of meters of rail per person, and then the y-axis shows GDP. That country way over there on the right is Australia, which has an astonishing amount of rail per capita, which really surprised me. Since when I think of Australia, I think of road trains or truck, whatever they're called, like the semi-truck, but instead it's got like 4 trailers behind it. That's what they do that in Australia, and I figured it's because they didn't have any rail, but that's not true. They've got a lot. Let's look at this again without Australia, just to see the trend again. And also Argentina now is the dot on the right. So you can see that Argentina is a country that's invested a lot into its rail networks, although its economy is... The other part of this is that one of the problems with GDP is the extent to which financial services make up a portion of that. And Argentina is hardly in the good graces of the international financial world, which is going to unfairly depress their GDP when we're using this, faulty measure to try to look at this. So that was good. That was putting together the different countries people chose, and people reflected on that, about what it meant that Argentina had a large amount of rail, that GDP is pushed up unfairly due to financial use, and then also just some countries, how low the amount of electricity use is per capita, which is really astonishing. Just to read off the spreadsheet here, the spreadsheet's in the video description also. The per capita electrical power rate in the US is almost 1,400 watts per capita. So if you think about, a 100-watt light bulb, which are now illegal, but if you can find some old ones, 14 of those light bulbs, that's the amount of electricity used per capita in the US on average. The lowest amount in any of the countries that were chosen here, some of the lower ones included Mexico, which only had 200, Egypt, 160, Vietnam, 50, and the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, 20. So 20 watts of electricity per capita in the Côte d'Ivoire. That's like less than a light bulb, and this is astonishingly low. And it's no surprise that the economy is not very, people don't live well. So that was the first question. The second question was about looting. In the previous reading from the book, Lynn, when talking about infrastructure, talks about the value of infrastructure, and then he goes right into how it's been destroyed intentionally by agents attacking the U.S. And one example he gave was the looting of the New Haven Railroad, where this occurred decades ago. People had bought up control of the railroad, stolen from it, and then left it to die. And the question for the homework was to find a similar example from more recent times. In a masterpiece of understatement, one of the homework respondents said, in 1984, private investor Carl Icahn launched an unwelcome takeover of TWA, unwelcome or hostile, as Trans World Airlines. I'm going to read this response. It's very good. He pledged to make the company profitable, but instead he stripped the company of its assets and made profit for himself. For example, he took the company public on the stock market, which netted him over $450 million in personal profit. The same deal put the company $540 million in debt. He told everyone in the company that he would purchase 100 new planes in the later part of that decade, and instead purchased 12. Then he sold the firm's exclusive London routes to American Airlines for $450 million, destroying the airline's strategic position in the market and its long-term viability. He took assets that had a future potential, and he ate them up in the present. TWA went through 2 bankruptcies in the early 90s and a third one in the early 2000s, effectively killed by Icahn. So it's a very good example of primitive accumulation, of looting, of using potential for the future and consuming it today instead. So that was good. Now the third question, I'd like to, Anastasia's not on, so I'll have to read hers for her. The third question was to write a story from the future. The end of chapter 9, LaRouche discusses how cities ought to be built in the future, and the homework was the assignment was to write a short story about a day in the life of a city-dwelling family in one of the new cities in the year 2050. So there were 3 good answers, and I'm going to read all 3. Well, I'll read this one, and then people who wrote the other 2 will read those. So Anastasia wrote, after the total annihilation of Wall Street in 2014, with the passage of the 4 Laws to Save the Economy bill in Public Houses, also known as the LaRouche Law, a new era began that had never been thought up for mankind thus far. The US, Russia, and China began an immediate cleaning up, which took a few years to do, along with sending a few bankers to jail, probably an understatement, and the President of the United States as well. Maglev rail finally began in the US after much negotiations with China and Russia on different models to use. New cities were built, most named after scientific and universal leaders. So a Boeing worker in JFK, Washington, in the year 2050, having remembered his father's grueling days at Boeing, was very relieved that the company was able to survive through the Great Meltdown so that he could be part in building the vacuum tunnels for the Bering Strait, which to his delight was to be opened to the public today. He and his wife decided that they wanted to catch the link rail to Moscow so they could see their 16-year-old son, who was studying at the new University of Vernadsky. They left their home and caught rail to the center of the city. They wanted to get a good breakfast, since they would be going a good few hours in a different time zone. So they stopped at the best cafe and pub in town, the Jerry Adams. It was owned by an Irish family who, once freed of the British, wanted to live in the town named after their favorite Catholic U.S. president, John Kennedy. So they moved to John F. Kennedy, Washington. They got the works: local-made sausage, bacon, eggs with baked bean toast, yum. Once filling themselves silly with a full Irish breakfast, they left to the grand opening of the Bering Strait Tunnel. They bought their ticket to Alaska, which linked up to the tunnel opening. It was about a 3-hour trip on the older maglev trains. The place was crowded. Everyone wanted to go to the opening. Children, seniors, students, engineers, scientists, you name it, from all around the world. Optimism filled the air. Arriving in the maglev tunnel in East Teller, Alaska, the president gave a fantastic presentation on the importance of high energy flux density and the progress of man. Taking the rail to Russia was part of the unified effort to uplift man to higher evolutions. The Boeing worker felt such a sense of pride. His wife felt such a sense of pride in what they contributed to society because it gave meaning to their parents, who fought through the final battle with the British Empire, and they knew that they were going to create a better society for mankind. So, yes. We got 2 more also. Choose your order there.
Okay. So this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's sort of like in a sense it's kind of parodic, but it's towards something that honestly we're going to have to deal with in terms of an artistic representation, I think. Okay, so bear with me. All right, so because it takes place in Mongolia, and which is where there's going to be a huge amount of growth, but I don't know how to pronounce any Mongolian names, but I looked up authentic Mongolian names, so. But it's a serious idea, despite the light treatment. Okay, Besud Sakyagin Elbegdorj woke up early on the morning of his son's graduation from college in the New Silk Road city of New Silk Road in Mongolia. Okay, because I imagine that there's going to be a lot of cities called New Silk Road in various, in various languages. So the university, having been founded in the same year that the city was founded, 2025, was commemorating its 25th year in existence. Besud and his wife, having eaten breakfast, left their home and walked a couple blocks to the subway. Within minutes, they had arrived at the university campus in the middle of the city. They arrived in time to see their son conduct a morning voice sectional in preparation for the grand festivities of the afternoon. The students diligently pressed forward in Beethoven's Ninth, to the amazement of Besud and his wife, and I'm just not going to try that name, so, Besud and his wife, who found the flowering of classical culture to be so deeply gratifying in contrast to their own youth that they each wept silently. As his son, Gan Batar, which means the Steel Prince, okay, strode confidently across the stage to receive his degree in thermonuclear fusion studies, a vision suddenly came before Besud's eyes. 2 images presented themselves to him at once. In one image, he saw Gan Batar in his youth. Besud guided the small boy to lay his hand upon the shockingly cool exterior of a massive vacuum tube, the construction of which Besud had directed as a foreman on the project. Simultaneously, before Masood's intellect glowed a plasma incorporeal, pulsating and rotating. It grew unceasingly. The vision passed. He cocked his head back, and he laughed with a defiant joy. His wife in arms. The end. Right, go ahead.
You can do this on the Mongolian embassy.
I think you're right.
I didn't create a new city. I figured, since Somalia was never developed, it would just be the capital city. So it's July 1st, 2050, and in Somalia they are celebrating Independence Day, 90 years since British and Italian rule. The Aden family decides to take their 3 kids to the museum dedicated to Somali revolutionaries. Mom and Dad, who both managed the museum, planned for the day. In the morning, the family took a high-speed rail to the south side of Mogadishu, where the museum is located. This is incredible because never before the turn of the century did Somalia have any serious transportation, none at all. The rail line hugged the coast of the city, so looking out one side you see the ocean, and the other side a view of the city, not to mention the train was super quiet so it didn't disturb the cities. There was an overwhelming sense of pride in the parents to see their city being renovated. They sift through beautiful rose gardens open to the public and newly constructed universities that was built so beautiful it was the center for scientific and cultural thought. The family took a pit stop in downtown Mogadishu, and surprisingly, in front of the city hall, which was modeled to look like the Acropolis, and had several replicas of Greek sculptures, including Prometheus chained to a rock, was a performance being held of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. The 3 kids were overcome by joy. Anyways, the family plans to take a bus ride to the museum for the duration of the trip. They get to the museum and the children lay eyes on a beautiful building with white pillars and rows of roses which guide you to the entrance. And once you enter, engraved on the museum wall is a quote from Homer's Iliad, which reads, "And what he greatly thought, he nobly dared." How befitting for this museum dedicated to men and women who fought for this nation. On this very special day, Mom and Dad tell their 3 children that their grandparents fought to free this nation and give you a future you are deserving of. This left an incredible impression on the children, which helped shape their lives.
So these stories they're real treats. It's really wonderful to get this sort of detailed, thought through idea of what the future will be like. It can't get beyond the struggle against the past. Well, this might come as a letdown after those stories, but question 4 is about what percent of GDP is related to financial services. Anyway, to get a sense of how, because chapter 10 of the book is about inflation. And Lynn says, look, you don't have to worry about inflation. The real cause of inflation is Wall Street sucking and sifting off money from every legitimate activity, creating monetary claims on actual services and production, which is like a tax on everybody. So the question was to figure out the size, to estimate the size of this. But there's some very good points were made. First off, the specific statistics were that 5% of the labor force works in financial services, which accounts for 8% of GDP, supposedly. Yet the conventional funds of these financial services were over 300% of GDP. These amounts of money don't make a whole lot of sense. And then, here's a really good point, is that so many other industries which tie into useless financial activity aren't going to be counted directly as that, but still their GDP or their economic contributions really mean that actually are a part of that. So, for example, buildings built for financial services, services for the financial sector. Take as an example the Facebook IPO. Any contribution of Facebook or similar information technology companies to GDP is essentially fictionalized by the manipulations of the stock market by Wall Street shitheads. It's like Amazon for years never made a profit, but it had this huge market capitalization. How do the capital gains on those stocks count into the GDP, for example, and it's on a company that never made any money. Also, how about healthcare? What percent of the money expended on healthcare is for healthcare versus what percentage is waste? And I think I don't know, I think the estimate I often see is that 30% of healthcare expenditures is to deal with insurance companies, their profit, and then all the extra clerical work for filling out the paperwork and submitting it. So, okay, so that was the last homework there. So now let's take a quick tour of this wonderful book and then talk about where we're going to go next. So, So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. It just right from the beginning, it's unlike any other economics book. Right from the beginning, Lynn makes a strong polemic that there are no neutral academic economists. That doesn't really exist. People are, at least the major players, they're not in an ivory tower. Like if you compare the work of Leibniz, of Franklin, of Hamilton, of Carey, and of List, the work that they did to create nations, to develop nations, the work, well, specifically Franklin and Leibniz, on promoting science itself, you compare that with Smith or Bentham, who had an outlook of the human species that was degraded and whose specific goal is to destroy the colonies in the United States. It's all political. So much of economic theory is political PR. Just like some journalist who is, promoting the government line on something, these economists might be a little bit better paid. Maybe they have to study longer in school before they get a job as an economist, as opposed to a journalist or a talking head. But much of it is the same thing. And he says right from the beginning, most of what people think of as economics is monetarism. Money's part of an economy, but when people think economics, they pretty much just think monetarism. Where's the economy? It's not there at all. Where's the physical economy? That's the real science. Monetarism is a part of it, and it's become the other way around. So in chapter 1, Lynn talks about how economics itself is a very powerful science. That economy is about production. The study of how the productive powers of labor are increased, that is a science. That's economic science, the science of physical economy. He introduced those terms that we use so much later, of work, of power, of energy flux density, and capital intensity, which you remember from some weeks ago is sort of tough to pull the two apart. And we came up with examples to fill out Lynn's statement that a limit of one would prevent the application of the other. So, for example, Ken gave the example of the Soviet Union, where there were scientific discoveries reflecting higher energy flux densities, but there was no civilian economy to provide the capital intensity to make them actually go into practice. And on the other side, we saw the video that Daniel found of Charlie Chaplin demonstrating an excessive investment of capital intensity without representing any higher energy flux density. It was, the automatic lunch feeding machine that, fed Charlie Chaplin all this food. Just totally a high capital intensity, but there's obviously no benefit of that. And then the homework from that chapter was to look at different kinds of energies and powers. Get a sense of how much power did the building that you were in use? How much electricity does your house use in a year? How much energy is in a gallon of gas? How long could a gallon of gas power your house? Just to sort of have some sort of meaningful notion of what these things were. In chapter 2, we got at the beginning of Mr. LaRouche's wonderful measure for global economy, as well as the whole concept of the difference between trying to make money individually, individual profits, adding up individual profits to describe a whole economy, and trying to think about a characteristic of an economy as a whole. And real economic growth means changing a global characteristic of the economy as a whole. It'll be reflected in individual profits, but are you changing the economy as a whole? And Lynn leaps into the fray on sociology and anthropology, and he says that you can measure the superiority of one culture over another. There's a metric for this. It's called potential relative population density. That nations, only societies which progress are qualified to survive and prosper. Only societies which develop increasing levels of potential relative population density deserve to and will continue to exist. that you have to organize your society if it's not doing that, or you're not going to be around. The only scientific basis for measuring economic value comes from a rate of increase of potential relative population density, he says. So this is also where he makes fun of the limits to growth. And the book, the idea, the concept in the limits to growth is that they make a model for the whole economy. They give pessimistically low values of the amounts of resources. And most importantly, they model the economy as it is, meaning no fundamental technological improvements. Then they run their model, and they say that after a couple of decades, mankind's doomed. Like, there will be so much pollution, we're going to be dead. Then they say, well, in their book, they say, well, let's say we develop new ways of dealing with pollution. Then they say, okay, well, later we're going to run out of food, and we're all going to be dead. Then they say, well, okay, well, let's run it again. Let's say agriculture got better. Then they say, well, we're going to run out of other resources, and we're going to be dead. Now, instead of realizing that because every time they make an adjustment, society, prospers longer, instead of realizing that, oh, as long as we keep doing that, we'll be fine, they say, forget. Mankind is fundamentally doomed. We're going to eat ourselves and pollute ourselves out of existence, so we should do that slower. They're not pretending that they figured out some way to avoid this problem. They're just saying, let's die slower by having less people. That's their great idea. Now, Lynn points out that what these guys actually proved is that we should be investing in fusion and building nuclear power plants like there's no tomorrow, because that is what society needs to survive, and without it, we're not going to make it. That's what their book actually showed, but it's not what... He made a funny quip. He said, perhaps for them, the death of the human species is preferred to admitting the incompetence of systems analysis. Of course, they want the death of the human species. I mean, this is this, Malthus thing. So he has a lot of fun with that. And then he opens up chapter 3 with a beautiful quote. Chapter 3 is about the thermodynamics of political economy. And he opens up with this really fun quote. It's poetic, where he talks about the laws of thermodynamics. And he says, contrary to the thoughts of those silly people who believe the laws of thermodynamics as taught to them, closer reflection reveals that these are laws of the legislative, not the scientific variety. You might ask people, what year were the laws of thermodynamics passed? Are the laws of thermodynamics constitutional? Should they be amended? Should they be repealed? Are they true? Those laws, just to anyway, the first law is about energy. It says that in processes that take place, energy can be transformed between different forms, but it is not created and it's not destroyed. So, for example, if you throw a ball up in the air, it has a lot of motion, it has motion energy at the bottom. When it reaches the top and it stops and it's about to start falling again, it has potential energy, same amounts of energy. That's the first law. The second law is the one that says the whole universe is decaying. It's basically saying that whenever there's a transformation of energy from one sort to another, it never becomes more organized. In general, it becomes less organized. The entropy, the disorder of the universe is always increasing. That's what the second law says. Now, this came out of a study of, the potential efficiency of heat-powered machines that Carnot had done to figure out, what role the steam engine could play in the economy. You don't know anything about the entire universe from studying steam engines. In fact, it's pretty presumptuous to say you know anything about the whole universe at all in that kind of specific of a way. The universe developing as a whole is one thing, but, that we can apply our physics as we understand it here on one planet to everything, like dark matter, it's a bit silly. So these laws of thermodynamics, they're actually both untrue from a human standpoint. The third one's not interesting. So the first one, this constant amount of energy, well, that's not true. When the law was passed, nuclear energy didn't exist. Obviously, after E equals mc squared and Curie and the development of nuclear power, if you tried to add up all the energy that existed on the Earth, your number was way off. You didn't include uranium, you didn't include thorium. So, the amount of energy is fixed, they say, but it actually just increased because of the creative powers of the mind. That's how Vernadsky would see that. The energy that exists just increased. Someone might say it was always there, but we didn't know about it, but that's what's important. What is the universe from the standpoint of our practice in it? The second law is just silly. It's really not worth even it's not really worth addressing too directly. So then, well, maybe we can talk about that more in the discussion period. There's more to say on that. Chapter 4 is on economic value. And this is where the letters came in, and the bars, the bar diagrams, where Lynn broke up the production into these different categories, like C, V, D, S, and S prime, where C was the production that was consumed in maintaining the productive process itself. V was the production that was consumed by the workers who were part of the productive process itself. So the guy working at a steel mill, when he has lunch, that would be part of V. The machinery at the steel mill, wherever that's produced, would be C. D is basically, D is overhead. So overhead included things that were useful, as we discussed. Teachers are part of overhead. From the standpoint of the productive part of the economy, teachers don't physically produce anything. We still want them. Doctors, part of overhead. Pimps, overhead, not useful. Advertising executives, overhead. So there was a lot of overhead. Military is overhead. Policemen are overhead. And then we also looked at S prime, the potential for growth in the economy, the free energy. And then Lynn talks about the importance of increasing the free energy of the economy, even while the capital intensity, the amount of C per V, is also increasing. From the standpoint of these categories, it became a lot easier to address the question from Chapter 2 about what capital intensity was. Because now you could just write C over V. And if you knew what it meant, it's a very... And then that part of the homework there was trying to figure out how much of the economy was C and V and D and S prime, which was really tough. So there were different approaches taken to that. One of them was that for V, people looked at the amount paid to productive workers. So pick categories of the economy that count as productive, find their average salary, look at that as total in the economy, and that would be a way of figuring out how much V made in the economy. C was kind of tough because it would be maybe with more looking and a lot more data analysis, you could get a sense of how much capital investment was made into businesses. And then overhead, we discovered, was most of the economy. One breakdown was that for GDP, it's a bad number, 22% of GDP came from production, which includes McDonald's as an assembly job, with the shift of, well, yeah, that's just like somebody assembling, a pacemaker, somebody assembled a hamburger, whatever. It's same kind of thing, building a house, whatever, building a house, building a hamburger, same thing. So McDonald's is included. Well, actually, that might be a service. Or that actually might count as production. I don't know. Manufacturing. Yeah.
Apparently this year, 50% of all U.S. earnings are coming from financial investments.
Wow.
Huh. The whole economy.
U.S. earnings?
Yeah.
I wonder if earnings means, you mean like salary, like personal earnings?
Like what you file on your income tax?
Yeah, like the salaries. The personal income of all Americans, like 50% of what they earn is just all from financial assets. I'm going to consider how many make nothing from financial assets. That really lets you know how much some people are making. So, it was fun getting into that, because trying to get some specifics about the economy, it's something that I think we learned in this class is something you can actually do. It might be very tough to get the right numbers. Somebody had written that the first step would be to to burn down the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BS with an L in the middle.
burn down the building, eliminate the concept of GDP, send engineers around to get a real estimate of what our productive powers were. We wouldn't need that because we found out how hard it was to try to estimate and figure out the things that we actually would need to know to measure the economy. Because the statistics are being measured with a totally different basis of what should be looked at. So it's way off. Also in that chapter, Lynn laid out the 3 areas of science he thought most important: plasmas, coherent radiation, SDI type things, and biology as biology. This is also where he talked about third world nations needing to leapfrog and actually trying to find a specific area of expertise or specialty to develop in. Otherwise, they'll always be developing. And have a plan of becoming an expert in something. Use some of that S prime, create S prime, and then use that for something cutting edge. He also talked about how your language culture fosters and prevents the ability to have profound thoughts. So this is where we looked at in the homework transitive verbs versus intransitive verbs. We looked at subjunctives from the standpoint of Lynn's emphasis on the need for transitive verbs and the subjunctive to be essential for thinking as a real scientist, for developing hypotheses and getting outside of the nominalism, the noun and adjective-based world of Aristotle and getting into the physical world of Brunelleschi, Kuhse, Kepler, the people represented, exemplified by the triads Lynn's discussed. And he ends it by saying that the real proof of science as practice, like the most fundamental proof that you can get, like how do you prove something? Aristotle or Euclid say, well, you start with some assumptions, and then if you show how you can derive something from those assumptions, that's how you proved it. If the initial assumptions were right, how do you prove that? Lynn says that economics is the highest proof of science. The proof of scientific discovery as a process is proved by economics, by the fact that we change our relationship to nature. This makes us the highest of sciences, economics. He continues this theme in chapter 5 on how technology is produced. This is where we get those levels of hypothesis, right? Lynn describes the simple hypothesis, which is like the Aristotle one, or where you is what I'm thinking in coherence with already recognized beliefs. Maybe I developed a new thought that would follow from what everybody already accepts, but it's a novel thought. That might be a hypothesis. He contrasts that with a higher hypothesis, where those assumptions themselves are called into question, where the subject of the thought isn't a specific idea that finds its basis in things we all agree on, but where the subject is that the thing we all agreed on was wrong. Basically, a real breakthrough. Kepler, a higher hypothesis. The vicarious hypothesis is a simple hypothesis, and it's shown to be wrong. Then Lynn talked about hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. That is, thinking about how can fruitful higher hypotheses be made. The philosophy of science. And he says that one of the best and clearest examples of a hypothesis of the higher hypothesis is, everybody remember? That's in a footnote.
Oh.
It's true. You're right. The Kuhse is not other, and the Riemann habilitation dissertation. So, and then this is where this wonderful section is, which you remember about the creature behind the door. That when you've got you're trying to, okay. You've got the way your mind functions is sometimes surprising to you. Sometimes you have a new thought, and you say, well, why did I get that new thought just now? How did that happen? Where did that come from? How can I have more of those? Is that coming from me, or what's going on? And he describes that the experience can almost be like there's a creature behind a door somewhere in your mind, and that if you pass the creature, paper under the door, then the creature will write back sometimes an answer, a creative answer, a new thought, and that you can best train this creature, make it very happy by passing it constructive geometry problems, for example,
And that when you become self-conscious about how, he says, there's people who make discoveries but don't know how it happened. He said, if you've got a worked out hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, it can be possible for you to open that door and recognize that creature as yourself, as your truest self. But look, there's a lot about us. We got personalities, we got things about how we act, how we behave, our pasts, our, things that we like, like desires, many of them not very important. They just sort of, like your kind of ice cream you like or something like that. But, what's irreducibly, what's unavoidably you? What can always remain as you despite all the changes that you go through? And this creature behind the door is the most you part of you. The way that you respond to changes, the way that you create them, the way that you read, develop your own thoughts, that's you. And when you feel challenged that your thoughts might be wrong, and you realize that you might have a change to make, and that part of your personality might be holding you back, or is holding you back, that there's a certain comfort you can take in that wasn't you anyway. That wasn't a irreducible part of you. It wasn't a part of you that was, inseparable and was going to be with you forever. Almost everything about us can change. And if we reflect back on the last years of our lives, I'm sure we can realize how much we have changed, sometimes very dramatically. Why couldn't that happen in the future? And we shouldn't be scared of leaping boldly into the truth, see where it takes you, and your identity can take it, because you're that creature behind the door. All right, that's you. So in the middle of this chapter, Lynn knows he's losing his audience, and he says, let's talk about concentration span now. What prevents people from making concentration span? And why is it sometimes good when giving classes to make dirty jokes? Because what are people thinking about sometimes when their minds wander? And he talks about the rise of the Playboy identity. That people's identity shifted from what you do to what you look like, what you consume, what you're seen as, how you're perceived. And that identity is deadly to society. When people's concerns are about how they're perceived, how they believe others will think they enjoy their leisure time, as opposed to what they actually accomplish with themselves, you have no future. You might ask, does popular opinion value having a long concentration span? Like among the things that are considered popularly good, things that people are like, oh, that's really great, I really admire that. Having money, that's great, right? Having money, having nice stuff, looking good, being a bold person, I don't know. And how often you hear about people think, wow, you know what? So-and-so's got a really long attention span. The winner of this last music festival, it's amazing. You can carry on a conversation for like 6 hours on all sorts of topics, and they're with you. I don't think that happens. So, unlock that door, that's you. He continues more with this science directly in chapter 6, which is a short but very compact chapter on work and energy. He gives one proposed measure for energy flux density. It's not kilowatts per meter squared, although that's a good one. He calls it kilowatts degrees per meter squared, for example. So you'd be looking, so watts per meter, watt is a flow of energy. So a light bulb is measured in watts. The longer you leave it on, the more kilowatt hours of energy you use. The light bulb's watt rating is the power. Power is a rate of flow of energy. Using like the normal physics way of talking about it. Lynn means something different in an economics context. But so Lynn says energy flux density is a flow of energy, watts per meter squared, how density do you have that energy. We also have to keep in mind what's the quality of that energy. So he says, think of the degrees, the temperature of it, for example. He also says, think about the wavelength of it, for example. You could have a certain amount of energy flowing through an area, but is it red light? Is it an ultraviolet light? Is it an X-ray laser? Same energy can have very different effects depending on what its quality is. And this is where, to get at this, because he's got this point about the quark and about why a universe based on particles is inherently entropic. And that could be a very thorny issue
And we addressed it by writing 2 different briefings on the Ukraine situation, remember? So one briefing was to describe what's going on in Ukraine from the standpoint of particles, and one was to describe what's going on in Ukraine from the standpoint of a whole. So I think that the responses on that one were very good. I think people got it. It was pretty clear, because it's something that we come across every day in organizing. Or do events make history, or does history drive events? And are you going to help people understand things if you start talking about, well, so-and-so in Ukraine is actually a Nazi, and blah, 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 blah. Or when you start from the top, that the British Empire is intent to create a war because the financial system is collapsing and this is their last shot. So chapter 7. Now we get into, Lynn's one chapter on what he said in the preface people think all of economics is. This is the chapter on money. And he says, I'm sorry to say it, this might not be considered polite in some circles, but everything you need to know about money can fit in one chapter. And he says the way most people treat this is like putting your pants on your head is the first step to pulling them up your legs. He says there's 2 big problems of the sticking your pants over your heads thing. One is the idea of the magic of the marketplace. The idea that price theory can successfully explain everything in economics. Just think about how much people, you sometimes do this, you do you do a class and you ask contacts, all right, well what's does anybody, what are any of the laws of economics? What are any of the principles of economics? What do you get?
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand, and
The magic of the invisible hand.
the invisible hand. Yeah, so what's that? I don't know.
Buy cheap, sell dear.
Buy cheap and sell dear. Buy sheep and sell deer. Okay. Livestock handling. Buy cheap. Supply and demand. There's one other thing. Usually there's only 2 things you hear. Maybe that's it. Supply and demand and the anyway, okay, supply, it's like, this is hardly an amazing breakthrough. Did you really need an economic genius that if a lot of people want to buy something and there isn't that much, it'll cost more? I don't know. It hardly seems that profound to me. But building up price theory, people try to say, because they want that to be true, they build up this very complicated system of economics to make that happen. The magic of the marketplace. Because prices make everything. Joking, it's like having the magic of letters. Every words are all built out of letters. So if we understand the letters and their relationships to each other, we'll all be great poets. It's like an economist saying they're going to explain everything based on prices and supply and demand and, the magic of diction. If you enunciate, whatever you say will be more intelligent. Nope. Well, it wouldn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to speak well. And then the second big thing of sticking the pants on the head is that so much of economics is actually just legitimizing usury. So like I'd said about the preface, you're trying to give backup and support for a political, oligarchical way of running the world. And you say, well, we need a lot of help doing this. So we need to make a really ugly culture so that people don't really think that they could be much better. We need to destroy science so people don't make too many we want to keep that under control. We also, of course, need to have a financial system that allows us to run things. So we need some economists who will explain that it's better that way and that it should be that way. In fact, are you really free as a person if you aren't able to enter into any contract you want to? I mean, isn't that everybody's idea of freedom? That's clearly what the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that's this country was fought on, the right to agree to any contract of your choosing. And it's not right to tell people that interest rate's too high and it's usurious. That is hurting personal freedom. So, all of this theory built on that. Lynn says, if you just throw away this obsession with price theory, and then you throw away all of the economics that is actually just to legitimize control by empire, you realize it's actually not that complicated, and you can put it all in one chapter. So this is where Lynn differentiated between the gold reserve system and the gold standard. There was a homework question on that, which was generally the answers on that one were very good. The one important thing to remember, I guess because the question only contrasted those two, the answers didn't really compare it to what we have today, which is a floating system, where money is like anything else and its value can go up and down. So just to review that very quickly, it's important. Under a gold standard, the amount of money is limited by the amount of gold you have. So your economy is limited by metal and the people who control it, which is London. under a gold reserve system, the gold functions for balance of payments, for dealing with your balance of payments things, like let's say every year with a trading partner country. Your imports and your exports, what's the difference? You settle that in gold, but otherwise, domestically, you're able to create credit, and you're not limited by the amount of metal that you have. And Michael talked a lot about this today in the weekly report. You compare that to today's floating exchange rate system. So unlike the gold reserve system, today there's nothing fixed between different currencies. Under the gold reserve system, under Bretton Woods, you didn't have to worry about exchange rates fluctuating between different countries, which made it a lot easier to engage in long-term projects. And it means you didn't have to hire Wall Street to write you interest rate options, because you didn't have to worry about it because they weren't exchange rate things, because they weren't. You didn't need the swaps because they weren't changing. That's part of that legitimizing usury. Wow, because it's an unstable world, you need us to. How are you going to manage risk without a derivative? Maybe you reduce the risk. Okay, so, and then Lynn gives his criteria for how to issue this credit. How are we going to do this through national banking? How are we going to get this credit out? Just to say a few of the things there. Lynn says you cannot use credit for consumer goods purchases except for a short period of time under extreme need. Where is that credit going to go? It's going to go to the production of capital goods. It's especially going to go to the production of the highest level, the most upstream point in the productive process. So if you've got, and this is one of the homework questions, there were a variety of different firms or cities asking for credit. It went from, producing food to producing clothes to producing machine tools to producing, to building bridges, maglev. And, the guiding theme in it was that you need to direct that credit to the highest level, which would be things like infrastructure, including energy, and to things, also science, and to the machine tool sector, because if you've got a better machine tool, and it's more precise, everything made with it can be better. Everything that those things then make can be better. So you have a real big multiplier factor compared to having a new kind of washing machine, which will make your clothes cleaner or something like that, but it's not going to affect anything else in the productive process. So go for the highest level. He wrote that monetary theory must be based on a pre-calculated effect on the physical economy. No monetary economics is allowed. There are no rules of money itself. It's silly. It's like having rules of words. He also talked about the investment tax credit, which is a great thing. I'm not going to say about it right now. Well, he said you shouldn't tax high income just because it's high. What are people doing with their money? Are you making income and then you're investing it in something that's great? Good. Get a tax credit. But Kennedy had those. It said like, okay, steel mills, you're investing in new equipment. Take the amount that you invested, that you spent for your new equipment, and then when you're filing your taxes with the IRS, take that amount and deduct it from your income. We're not going to count that for your taxes. So that's that's an indirect way of the government helping to finance specific types of investments in different companies without the government actually buying a new drill press, and you got the government-owned drill press in the factory or something. Then he ends it with this beautiful thing about what equity really is. It's not about money. It's about a right to immortality. The most fundamental human right isn't the right to enter into your usurious contract because, damn it, you have the right to do whatever you want. It's, do you have the right to know at the time of your death that your life was useful and essential? That's the highest human right. Compare that with the hedonic slavery of these other guys who say, well, just follow your passions. God made the universe so good. If everyone does that, it'll all work out great. And when you're choosing your pleasures and avoiding your pains, don't forget that going against the empire is probably very painful and therefore a bad idea for your life. You won't be happy doing that. You might get killed. So just find out which kind of drugs you like the best. That's freedom. Right. Right. You don't have the right not to be poor or not to think every day at the end of your job, wow, that was useless. But at least you have the right to zone out and not worry about it because you got high at the end of the day. That's freedom. So then he looks at the people that make up the economy. Chapter 8 is on wages and population. Really fun chapter. He talks about education. It's just as you have to invest in it's similar to capital intensity in an economy. How much capital investment are you making in people before they become productive workers? What do they need to know? Are there jobs that require knowing a lot and being able to change what you do? So he says that, even as we move into the future and even as we learn more and more and know more and more, education, we're not going to have people like getting out of school at the age of 40 in the year 2100. You're not going to say, sorry, you know what, we had to stay until the 20th grade because there's just so much knowledge now and there's so many bubble tests that you're going to be in school till you're 40. He says, no. When you make breakthroughs on the essentials, on the fundamentals, learning gets easier. So we're not, he says at most, like 25 is sort of an upper age range today for people, getting out of school and, doing whatever. Like 25 is you could be out of medical school at 25, for example. And that's pretty old. And then you can't even start working for another couple of years. It's pretty old. He said we're not going to go beyond 25 for anybody. More people might go up to that level, but we're not going to be going beyond that because when we rid education of bad textbooks, incompetent teachers, stupid lesson plans, and although they hadn't been invented yet, he would have said bubble tests or iPad tests or whatever they got now, you can really get a lot done. And I know that's something that convicts get astonished by. So I was working on geometry with us or a lot of things. They say, "Wow, it's so simple. It's easy. Why didn't they do that in school?" And it's not because there wasn't enough time. It's not like doubling the square takes like 4 weeks of study or something, or the Pythagorean theorem takes like a whole year. I mean, okay. So then this other great polemic that Lynn makes at the end of the chapter is about the plumber and the mechanic and who's driving the car, and about putting things in context. So he makes this beautiful organizing point from the standpoint of economics and industry, where he says, let's say that you've got a...
Yeah, it's still...
There we go. Let's say that you've got a machine, and it's got belts and pulleys and wheels and moves around, and there's some part of it that you replace with a laser. So presumably this might be some sort of cutting machine. The rest of it's all the same, but you've got this laser cutter there now, and so now it can chomp through twice as much metal in a day. You didn't change any of the rest of it. You didn't change the gears and the pulleys and the belts and the axles or whatever. How valuable are each of those parts now? The whole machine got more efficient in what it could do in a day because you replaced one part of it with a laser. But the whole machine became more valuable. If it does twice as much, it's twice as valuable now. So that gear just became twice as valuable. That belt that's driving it and moving it around and positioning it is twice as valuable. That power cord where you plug it into the wall, twice as valuable. So he says same thing with people. He says plumbing hasn't changed dramatically recently, but what are you plumbing? Are you plumbing a building built for financial services? Are you plumbing an executive bathroom at Chase Manhattan? Or are you plumbing a laboratory at a national lab? Same kind of work, but the value of it, just like that gear in the machine, depends on what the whole thing's doing. So the same thing with the mechanic, he says. How valuable is the job of a mechanic? Doing an oil change. Yeah, part of it's doing a good oil change, but then, what's the car going to be used for? Is the car being driven by a pimp? Is the car being driven by some industrial person? He says about a farmer. He says, somebody who's working in a scientific field, they have breakfast, maybe they have a bowl of cereal, they drink milk. You don't have a more high-tech cow. You don't have a fusion-powered udder or something. You get milk out the same way. But that milk is more valuable because of the person drinking it is more valuable. The farmer's work is more valuable, even if they're not directly using new technologies, although they probably will be if we're having them. So he says on page 163, he's got this great quote. He says, for better or for worse, Each of us is a person of universal significance. Every person lives in universal history. And the homeworks on this I thought were great. As people described different jobs that they had had in the past, and what kind of value they took out of that job. Like people described working at Quiznos as, not being all that rewarding. But then even doing good things. Someone had been helping, helping somebody, other people learn how to read. And it seems like a good thing to be doing. But what's the context? What's the whole society doing? You might feel good about that, but it's not, are you actually doing something good? Are you actually doing the best thing you could be doing? Are you acting according to the presumptive will of God? Nope. It's a bigger project. So it's when we act on that level of changing the context for everybody that we're being as fully human as we could be. And that's the joyous job that we have. We got the best job. So chapter 9, infrastructure. And this is a fun chapter. So he starts by talking about infrastructure, then he talks about the oligarchy, then he talks about infrastructure again. So he opens up, he says, look, we've done economic studies, and we found the biggest correlation in economics was between investment in infrastructure and then growth in the productive powers of labor. Huge correlation. You invest in infrastructure, well, within a year, your productive powers of labor go up. He says, but now let's look at this. Why has that not been happening? And then he goes through, basically it's like a 2-page version of Treason in America. He goes through, the families, the we versus they, the families, the oligarchy that has hated the U.S. and wanted to prevent its development, in countries around the world, to prevent development. He says, so going to these groups with proof that, hey, we're not investing in our infrastructure, this is catastrophic, they're not going to care. That's the point. So he says, well, is this a conspiracy then? Yes. But he says most people recognize the conspiracy wrongly. They look one level down from where it's really happening. You see the lackeys, and it seems like a conspiracy. Partly because you can't figure out why they would be doing what they're doing. He says the real action takes place a little higher among these families, among the we, who simply say, something ought to be done about that. And then, the rest of the gang gets into action on it. That's where it's really happening. And he said people make this mistaken idea about these conspiracies as being based on greed. The emotional drive behind Queen Elizabeth, it's not greed. It's the sort of thing you kind of don't want to put your mind in the ability to even understand what her emotional life is like. But you get it with Zeus. I mean, it's that Zeusian outlook. Zeus wasn't greedy. Zeus didn't say, hey, I want all the gold and all the money. Zeus had an idea about himself as the ruler and people as animals to be destroyed or done whatever you please with. That's not greed. That's oligarchism. That's Zeus. So that's one of the, Lynn identifies that as being this problem with people looking at conspiracies, that it's not greed. It's Zeus. Go all the way on that one. And then just one other interesting thing from there is the cost of depreciation. He says if we don't maintain our infrastructure, rebuild it with higher levels, that's not money that we saved. That's a cost that we simply didn't write on our books. If you've got something, you let it fall apart, and you say, well, I saved money on maintenance. I didn't have to do any repairs. Well, then your car breaks down. I mean, all along the way, it was losing its value, and you simply just didn't write that down. So he says, where is he gave a figure of $3 trillion even back then, in '84, of the amount needed to get infrastructure up to snuff. Today, the American Society of Civil Engineers says $3.6 trillion, which seems kind of low, considering how big Lynn thought it was in '84. Although there are figures, anyway. So you'd say, well, during that time, if you're saying, well, our GDP's been great, our income's been great, did you include the fact that you were primitive accumulating? Did you include that cost? So then after talking about these awful oligarchs, he talks about the cities of the future, and he says we should design them based on what it would be like to live on the moon. And we should build these things tough, ready for hundreds of years, cities to last centuries. Start with the infrastructure, make it incredibly good and durable. And it'll cost a lot, but it's worth it. And
when we've got 50% of the population being productive, we're not going to be poor, and we'll be able to do things that involve a lot of investment and cost because there's so many people producing. So it'll work. And then in chapter 10, he says, pass Glass-Steagall. Chapter 10 is about inflation. And like I said at the beginning, because it came up from the homework questions. Lynn talks about kinds of inflation, but then he says, look, the biggest type of inflation is the tax of Wall Street. That these guys make funny money or are given $85 billion a month by the government. Quantitative with the easing, bailouts, everything else. Speculation. You create money. That money can be used to buy things. It can be used to say, hey, this thing that you made, I'm going to take that now. It's basically a tax on everybody else. He said, you want to wipe out inflation? Don't worry about credit. Worry about Wall Street. They're the ones causing the inflation by creating huge amounts of money without contributing anything in the process while they're doing so. It's just stealing.
This was the year that Alan Greenspan was writing Rethinking Glass-Steagall.
Oh yeah? 84. Oh wow. So Lynn was pre-thinking Glass-Steagall. Anyway. So that's like a short version of the book. There's so much in this book. What a good book. It's really well composed. So we can talk about things. I just wanted to lay out. You'll find in the video description a quick survey and about the class and a final homework proposal, which could be, these are some of the ideas that had come in. Either one, find an article about economics that's bad. It should be very easy. So an article, an op-ed, letter to the editor, whatever it is, respond to it using concepts from So You Wish, and see if you can get it published. So that's an idea. Number two would be plan out a class or a class series. So, or how you would implement it. How are you going to get people to it? How's it going to work out? In other words, how are we going to get this stuff across to more people? How are we going to recruit people with it? And the third idea is to, this one's tough given how bad the statistics are, but make an economic hypothesis and then pull together numbers to make your point. In other words, make a chart for organizing, you might think of it as. So, some of the ones that we tried along the way were more difficult than others. You might not put percentages of C, V, D, and S prime on a sign, at a table. But some of the things in terms of doing intelligence, like how do you get outside of money? One of the things we talked about last week was how, EIR would pull together these figures of average weekly paychecks to pay for fill in the blank. So a typical family's insurance premiums, how many weeks of paychecks does that cost? Typical family's mortgage or rent over a year, how many paychecks does that cost? So that's a way to, it pulls you out of money and then lets you make a specific statement about, hey, here's where things are going, here's where we are. Or if you look at a time from the past when things were good, such as with the Apollo program or with Roosevelt's New Deal projects, you might be able to make a wonderful point about what we can expect moving forward with the same economic system. So those are some ideas for a final project, and that's that. So it's been a very fun time. Anybody have any thoughts, reflections, questions, tears to shed? Joy, okay. Tears of joy. It's over.
Well, I have one
It's definitely been a lot of fun and very helpful in the field. Like talking to people out in the population, it's been very helpful, this class series.
Good. Not totally abstract and hard to apply at all.
Yeah, I think that's true. it'll give you you have a solid foundation by which to so that you can talk to people without and know that you're not talking about something populist. You're not talking according to popular opinion. If your intention over the course of the call is this person has to get a principle from So You Wish, from the corpus of Lynn's work, you know. But now you have a much deeper, at least I know I do, have a much deeper and broader conception of what that is. I also think that we should, that the handful of people who really were closely involved in this class, that we should generate a lot of excitement and urgency around the next phase of the Wednesday process, because we should just have a big leap from only a handful of people regularly doing the homework to having 15 people on this who are newer members or of a certain type who are putting that out, because it's true. I mean, it was a great benefit to be able to read other people's answers and see how people think things through, and then to incorporate that into your own idea of what we're doing. So I'll just make that plug, right?
Yeah, what I've been discussing here with the SF crew is just this idea of taking it and bringing more young people and just people in the population to actually be able to know, because I mean what we're doing out in the population is we're educating people on a way to rethink the way that they're used to thinking. And I mean, that's what LaRouche's So You Wish book it really gets at, is actually being able to understand the American system way of thinking about economics instead of what we grew up in school, learning in school, which is the British form of history and economics, which is completely backwards and false. And we actually have the opportunity to give them the insight of what it is to be a real American. And we just, that we've been just discussing here how we have to really start bringing people into a more of a class series here to actually get people who are wanting to be more close to be involved in that process of relearning the American system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the next phase of this is going to be on Cusa and Kepler, which it applies differently. I mean, this is obviously, economic polemics you can obviously use directly, constantly. And one aspect, as you brought up about the American system compared to the British stuff that we're taught and inundated with in schools, this idea that Adam Smith is the foundation of the United States, which is so stupid, They say Cornwallis is, the basis of West Point or something. I don't know. The other aspect is also the honesty in it, and the fact that it's a scientific discovery. This is the scientific practice of economics. This isn't who can get their ideas put out so that they can gain some sort of benefit from it. This isn't just like playing politics, the practice of economics. It's a real science. And, taking part in, this is a scientific discovery, Lynn, this is a discovery, okay? This book's a discovery. So, in terms of some of these next phases on Cusa and Kepler, and developing or refreshing, as the case may be, a real understanding of what science is, of learning more about that creature behind the door, that is essential for having an idea of what it is to be a person. I mean, that's a certain human aspect of us and of everybody around us that has to be touched.
So the same, music touches people, culture touches people, it touches something inside them that they didn't know that they had, and they're going to resonate with it. And in terms of pulling people up out of ugliness and desperation and just the environment around us, when you help people realize they've got something beautiful and creative in themselves that they share with every other person, this is the true nature of the human species, this is the true nature of our fellow men and women, that gives you a strength to say, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna join, to do, to really so it's going to be a different phase from the the outside appearance in terms of where we're going next, but it's as essential. It's not indirectly related to organizing. It is an understanding of what we need to touch and develop in people that we're talking to, and in general in the human species as a whole, so that we have a culture that's making the breakthroughs that are needed on fusion, on antimatter, on biology as biology. So we don't all, die of staph infections or something in 2 decades.
I think this is a really critical point in terms of the, just the how are you going to be, the question of educating the population and educating the context, because if you're thinking about this is the question of a horizontal style of organizing versus a vertical style of organizing, I think, because it's extremely important for the phone work that you can see yourself as educating a person along a certain curriculum of a sort. The field work lends itself to a kind of a one-shot deal, a one-night stand, right? So you have so you're just trying to get across some one sharp idea, generally, and there's exceptions to that, but that's generally the way it works. And then there's a kind of a lower level phone organizing, where you're calling new people, and which people we really don't do nearly enough of in the organization, in terms of really focusing on the upgrade work. But even when people do that, then it tends to be, again, like a sort of a one-shot deal. Okay, I can definitely go deeper, I can have a certain kind of a higher quality of a dialogue with a person, but it's going to be one go, and then I'm going to get it, and then and then we'll pick it up later, and I don't know, you don't have a plan at that point. Whereas the absolute best organizing that we do in the organization is where you actually have faith in the other person having a mind, and you seek to develop them over a period, which means being able to look at Lynn's work in physical economy and see it as a developing concept, and not just something singular in terms of not because I've heard this. You hear this with people. You hear this with people who have long-term contacts where every time they get on the phone they're having the same discussion, and then it crashes eventually because the person says, well, eventually this kind of wears off, and the person starts to distrust you, I think, because you're just talking about the same thing over and over again, as opposed to, and you're basically saying, trust me, trust me, trust me, and the person's going to trust you at first because you mean it. But if you don't have a way to convey to them, to give them the foundation that you have, then nothing's going to happen.
Anything else?
Thanks, Jason.
You're welcome. All right, well, that'll wrap up this series then. If you have watched this class somehow without seeing or knowing about the rest of them, you'll find the link to the full series in the video description. Also, the homework assignments that are in every video description, you'll find the links there. You know, some of them say what the due date is in them. That was during the original class series. But feel free, also anybody watching this right now, if you haven't done any of the ones in the past and you'd like to in the future, feel free to do those homeworks and then send them to the email address in those homework documents. Send them in later. We'll get back to you. So it's not too late if you missed it the first time around and you're watching this later. So, thanks for joining.
Well, let's give Jason a round.
Okay.